the start. We didn't want to pass, we didn't want to physically pass work because we didn't know exactly what was happening with that. The biggest thing was to get people connected and keep people connected from a health and safety point of view as well.
Thank you for that, Mr. Clark. And as we talk more in this discussion, we'll find out more from your perspective how you are able to reach those young people, particularly those who have been really impacted by the virus mentally,
Mhm.
the impact that that's had. And as you now have transitioned back into school, what steps you had to take to make sure that they didn't fall through the cracks, so to speak. And so now we move to Tara Nielsen, the director of ARC, and for her thoughts.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having ARC here today to contribute to this invaluable conversation, and to R3 and Maples Group for making it possible, constantly stepping up to support the community and community programs like this. This conversation's long overdue, needs to be in the forefront of conversation every single day, not just occasionally. So let this be the start of something that we can keep stepping behind and talking about. I founded ARC with my dearest friend in 2006, God to serve and love those in crisis. I've lived in Cayman for 21 years. My family came before me in the 60s. Cayman's my home. Wherever God plants me is my home. I love all people and care deeply about people, and really devote my life to trying to alleviate suffering. We work closely with Big Brothers Big Sisters now, which is a really wonderful partnership. Um, Going back to the beginning, 15 years ago, we started to see some of the cracks in society here. And we've learned over the years where the caverns are and where we're needed. And we go into the homes of families island-wide. So we really do get a first row seat view at how families are living. And it was really shocking as I began to learn how serious things were, and the deficits and the conditions that children and families lived in. And I think we've seen firsthand the model, what happens when you don't have mentors? What happens when you don't have positive people in your life? What happens when you haven't got a village around you? And the truth is, it's almost impossible to come back from that. We've lost many generations to that. So we work really hard every day through various programs that we have, and partnering with other amazing programs on the island to really wrap as many programs and mentors and positive initiatives around the whole family. So we have a program called MARE, which is Mentor, Educate, Reinforce. And we go into the local, the government schools. We have a strict criteria, and we select children from disadvantaged homes who are also displaying significant delays in learning. We don't just take that child and implement this first-class intervention. We first go to the home. Is anyone here who's a parent will understand that when things are difficult, it's difficult to be a good parent, right? So unless we start at home with the mum, we deal with a lot of single mums, unfortunately. We have to start at the very beginning, and the very beginning is mummy and home. So we go into the home. We did some assessments this week as we're expanding into John A. Cumber, which is exciting with our program. So we start with a series of assessments. We're assessing 15 families, going into the home, meeting mum, meeting the kids. And I think everyone in this room, even those exposed to some of the harsh realities here, would be brought to tears. So we go into the home, we see your floors collapsing, your ceilings collapsing, you have no power or water. And within a hug, within the ear, within a heart, within kindness, the mother will completely collapse. And you see that they are alone, totally, totally alone. You have to start at the home. So the MARE program and partnering with Life and BBS and all these other wonderful programs and people in the community, we wrap ourselves around the mum, the house, the food, activities, mental health, plugging them into all these other resources. There are countless amazing resources. And we really lift up the family, to put that child in a place where they are ready to learn and thrive. We have to provide a home, a safe, clean home. They can go to school showered and fed, and their mother could be in a positive mood. And then we provide the amazing teachers, and then they have all the amazing staff in their government schools. It's working together. There's room for all of us to do this together. When lockdown happened, ARC was already in a position of knowledge, fully aware that there would be thousands of people without food, access to food. So we initiated the Kindness Kitchen out of Deckers. We had over 50 volunteers delivering meals every day of the week, or 5 days a week, 8,000 meals a week. It was a great opportunity to actually arrive at the home, really see people. It was the only hope, the only conversation, the only thing they had to look forward to. People who were completely cut off from life. So that was a really powerful outreach. And we are still today, as John talked about, we're talking like COVID is over. COVID, we may not have the sneezing and the coughing and the symptoms there, but we have the economic impact and symptoms that we see every day. And thanks to R3 and other organizations that help fund our programs, we're able to assess COVID impacted families every day and assess their situations. And as the 1st of August approaches, the 1st of every month approaches, it's a very, very terrifying time. How am I going to pay my rent? How am I going to feed the children? I still haven't got my job. I've gone from 6 days a week to 6 hours a week. What am I going to do? We have an amazing community that comes together and provides resources for them. But these people have children who are having to absorb this anxiety and this stress and the mental health crisis around us. So we have to really pull together more than ever. There's no time for sleep or rest. We have to pull together, we have to find these children, we have to wrap all these modalities around them as soon as possible, as consistently as possible. And we're showing that we can do it, and we just have to work harder every day to make sure we provide everything they need. They need the village, they need the nation.
Thank you so much. And, at the risk of sounding repetitive, I've used the adjective important so many times already this morning. This is why this conversation is so important, because as both Tara and John spoke about, there is a sector of our community that is hidden, that people are not seeing every day, that you are experiencing every day because of the work that you do. And that's why we have to have these conversations so that we as a community are aware and can do our part to make sure that we're addressing. And this is the role that we're talking about today, that mentors play in regards to the challenges our young people are facing, especially now with the impact of the pandemic that is still swirling around us. And so with that, over now to Jason Jones, the counselor at On Course Cayman, representing the Alex Panton Foundation here this morning for his introductory remarks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Jones, and I'm a licensed counselor at On Course Cayman and a private practice working with Dr. Alexander Bodden. But I'm here representing the Alex Panton Foundation today, and I've been in and around and collaborating with Alex Panton since their startup a few years ago. And Alex Panton Foundation is a nonprofit that really works to raising the awareness and support, reducing stigma and advocacy for youth and young adults in the islands, the Cayman Islands. And over the last few years, I've watched them literally work with many stakeholders, education and sports and private practice and government, helping reduce the stigma around children and young people getting access to services. I've seen them advocate for individuals reaching out for help to get help with anxiety and depression. And it is stemmed from a very passionate personal story from Jane and the Honorable Mr. Panton. They continue to move forward in this time, and I think I'm also a big believer that it takes a village to raise a child, very much so. And in the good old days, it was the family members, it was the neighbors, it was the community. But it looks very different today. Today, families are more spread out. There's less community and neighborhood kind of cohesiveness. And I'm really a big believer that it takes the professionals in the community, the coaches, the principals, the teachers, the cadet leaders, the big brothers, the bigs, those kinds of individuals that continue to wrap around a child and provide the protective factors that keep them from going down roads of places we don't want to see them go. The things that they're at risk for. One of the major things that Alex Panton has brought awareness to is the risks that our youth are exposed to. The risks of severe mental health issues, suicide, substance abuse, getting in with gangs, dropping out of school, going to jail. Whenever I meet a young person that is very, very at risk because of either their family situation, the socioeconomic situation, their struggles at school, maybe maybe they just had a learning disorder when they were 5 or 6 and never got assessed properly. And the gaps continue to grow, and they've continued to rather be bad than stupid, and get into trouble and get kicked out of class and stuff like that because they don't know why they're different and nobody's ever stepped in and helped them. So I've always been a big believer in that village, and I take personal responsibility in being part of that village. So I've been here on island for 4 years now, so I do come from away. But the reason I came here was I wanted to help Cayman's children most of all. And I recognized that there was a huge um, gap, between kind of ultra wealthy and ultra poor, and they all existed here and everything in between. And I couldn't imagine, potentially growing up, because I grew up in a poor neighborhood. I grew up in a social assistance family. I grew up in the hood, in Moncton, New Brunswick, Canada, and had a single mother. And she had abusive boyfriends and stuff that came from jail. So I grew up in that kind of an environment, and I couldn't imagine, being here, a Caymanian, growing up like that, looking around at all this wealth around you. And boys, oh boys, I'd be awfully resentful and tempted to be robbing them. uh, so the temptations are there, and I'm working with a young fellow right now, and I'm trying to get him in basketball because he likes basketball. And we're trying to keep him at John Gray. And, I'm having those conversations with him that, instead of people trying to control him, like, mommy's trying to control him, I'm trying to say, like, like, you don't want to end up like this, right? Father's in jail, that kind of stuff. And I said, so you're going to be faced with decisions, more and more decisions on your own that you need to make to move yourself towards what you want or don't, away from what you don't want in life. The panelists are absolutely right. The effects of COVID, even though we have been very safe and we've been virus free in the community for over a year now, I think, the effects we're not saved from. The economic devastation. So many families and people have lost their jobs, their businesses, most of their pensions, their savings, and they're struggling now. And as well as the mental and emotional anguish that goes with that, the stress that's in the home. I had an 18-year-old come to me, and he paid for counseling out of his own pocket because he knew that mom and dad were stressing, and he had some savings from an old job, and he was able to pay for a couple sessions out of his pocket. And that just touched me because it was an 18-year-old young man that knew he needed help, that didn't want to stress his family, and took his own money. And luckily, my heart went out to this guy so much. And luckily, we had a student working at OnCourse that had worked with Alex Panton Foundation, Miss Zoe, who's a superstar in the counseling world. She did some time in Atlantic or Wellness Center, I believe, and with Alex Panton Foundation as well. She said, "Hey, guess what Alex Panton Foundation's doing now?" I'm representing them, but I wasn't fully up to speed. They're actually offering financial assistance to young people under 30 that need counseling and they can put an application in that don't have insurance. He's not in school, he's not working, and hopefully cover some sessions for him to receive the help he needs. And we're talking about a guy that was literally suicidal coming in. So my heart really went out. I would consider him high risk. Um, Even though we're in this bubble, um, many families have siblings that are away at school, children, grandchildren away, grandparents away, people worried about their family overseas, trying to make plans to see family. Thankfully, Zoom has become a mainstay for us in the video chatting, but nobody should have to go through a Zoom funeral conference. And that's happened. I've seen the desperation of family members dying and us not being able to get to them because of travel restrictions. So the anxieties, the stressors, the sadness, the depression that's come out of these times. We always said in the mental health field that these are only going to start surfacing and coming around for up to 18 months after. So I'm glad to be part of these discussions and look forward to more.
And thank you for that, because as you've highlighted, and as the other panelists have highlighted, this is going to be very much a community effort, and the various roles that we play. And, this is important to government. I also want to acknowledge that we have the Honourable Catherine E. Banks-Wilkes with us, Deputy Speaker and Parliamentary Secretary for Financial Services and Education, as well as Minister Bernie Bush, who's here. And I know, in particular, for Mr. Bush, this is near and dear to his heart: young people, sports, making sure that they're captured before they fall through the cracks. And that's why we're here today. And so we've been talking about the difficulties, the challenges. And I do want to tell the audience right now, those who are here with us at CIS, as well as those tuning in over Facebook, and that the way in which I normally do these conversations is just that. They're a conversation, they're a discussion. So I'll ask a question of one of the panelists, but if someone would like to add to it, give further remarks, please do so. You don't need to wait on me to ask a question, all right? So we're going to have this conversation now. So I'll start with you, John. In terms of the difficulties that you talked about, was there a single most difficulty with the young people that you saw as a result of the pandemic that they were faced with?
I think they missed being out of school. I mean, generally they missed, I said the word connection a lot at the start, but they generally missed that routine of being in school. For some of them, it's just absolutely essential, especially some of those that are coming from some of the more disadvantaged backgrounds. And I don't just mean financially, I mean often in time or, resources. Many of the students just don't have a family that can give them what they need. And that's where school comes in as well, to try and complement that. And that's where mentors come in. But it's hard to nail down one single thing. Obviously, we had some students that were just hungry, and we were really grateful for support from the community, and we could go out and deliver the equivalent of school meals and give people vouchers. We talked about the connections on the laptops. We needed to try and get learning going, and we wanted it. We wanted to show that learning was going backwards and forwards. So just having a work packet wasn't good enough for us because we couldn't see the learning was taking place. They're writing, but we couldn't see the learning. So that was really important. But we've really struggled with students that have kind of gone backwards and gone into their shells. They've lost that positive mindset that we spend so much time trying to build up with them. And that's the bit that we're really trying to overcome right now. We're trying to get them back into a place where they're feeling positive about themselves, where they're believing that they can grow and they can be just about anything they want to be, but their work ethic is the most important thing there. But there are things that will sneak into their lives. We've seen, and I'm sure colleagues up here will see, we've seen a massive increase in things like vaping.
Coping mechanisms.
Yeah,
then.
coping mechanisms. I always say, when you're looking at future education success, what are some of the things, what are the barriers to it? There was a nice model, the model of the educated Caymanian that I saw when I first came here. And I immediately looked as well, and I said, well, let me look and see what's the model of the uneducated Caymanian. And it was things like addiction. Freedom from addiction is absolutely key for us. Some of those students have spent a lot of time lockdown on computer games, and they're not all bad, but they're all bad if you're playing 14, 15 hours a day and not getting human interaction. Being able to, satisfy yourself with tobacco or another substance, and becoming addicted to that as a young person is going to have huge knock-on effects for the rest of your life. So we did find that some of the students, more insular, being on their own a lot more, had more opportunity to do things that are going to be detrimental to themselves later on. And we're in a recovery process about that now in school.
So Paul, picking up
Yeah.
from what John just said, in terms of sports,
Mhm.
are you finding it difficult to bring them back into that arena, so to speak, from what John said there?
I think it's easy to. I think my volume just went up, but I think it's easy to bring them back because they want to come back. But just to complement what John spoke to, the evidence in terms of the issues and how they exploded. I'm glad you actually mentioned vaping because vaping has been around forever, for years, and there's been a problem at home and schools and so on. But I think post the pandemic, there was definitely a huge increase. And I'll give you an example. So if you combine the stresses with the lack of sort of physical contact, and then therefore the need for all of us, adults and kids, to then find contact in some other way, what occurred was that kids became much more into and proficient with connecting virtually, right? And at all age groups. So the best example I'll give you is the example of a 12-year-old who was able to go on Instagram, see the advert for drugs that was being sold by a 19-year-old, arrange for the 19-year-old to deliver the drugs outside the home of the 12-year-old. The 12-year-old is at home, mom is in the other room watching Apple TV. The 12-year-old just walks outside casually outside in his front yard, gets the drug, right? And then goes in the garage and uses it. So this is
This is here in Cayman
yeah, this is here.
now.
So yeah.
All right.
So the point is that these things are happening. I think we all know they're happening, right? So I was just giving you an insight into like example of the things that I thought increased. And so this is the thing. So the kids are and because they're kids, they don't think about what they're doing. So the 19-year-old was advertising very freely on Instagram,
Wow.
right? Obviously, if he's smart, he wouldn't be doing that. But he's not. He's a kid as well, right? They're kids, and so they're doing these things. Thankfully, they're not very smart criminals, which is a very strange thing to say, but that's a good thing because we know what they're doing. So those things that happen more frequently. Vaping actually exploded. I believe vaping exploded. I think what John is saying, getting access to vaping equipment, getting access to the juice, the different types of flavors that go into it, and the fact that some of those flavors, by the way, it might say violet or pineapple or whatever, but actually they're very dangerous because they may have other things in them. They have no idea what's in them, right? But to them, oh, it's a nice, cool color and it's a nice flavor, and they do it. And so there was a huge education around that. So for us as a club, we actually have sessions. So we had to have sessions with all the teams. Another good example is alcohol. So alcohol and what I've never seen before, I saw for the first time in 11 years. I saw an issue with girls players and
And alcohol?
with experimenting with alcohol. And I'm not saying girls, boys, bad, good. I never seen it with girls before. I'm just telling you the actual experience.
And to be
So
clear, post
post-pandemic.
pandemic.
So just outside the pandemic, and again, because they're kids, this is not something that is not hidden. It's on Instagram, and you can see them, drinking and taking pictures, cool pictures of them with vodka, knocking it back and celebrating that, so the others could see them, and they all kind of join in the celebration of that. But it's antisocial behavior, we call it, but it's not a good habit. So we had meetings with the girls teams, more education meetings, right? So we don't name anybody or accuse anyone. We're just saying to the girls, listen, these are some of the things that are happening out there. This is what people are doing. My message to actually our older girls team was very simple. I said, adults drink alcohol. They do it lots of ways. Adults do this stuff. We know that you know that these things are happening because you see your parents doing it, right? All we're saying to you as 15 to 17-year-old girls is that you don't want to develop that habit at this point in your lives, because then you become addicted. And what happens with addiction, and we learned this, in fact, Shannon, remember this? We had a police officer come to talk to the boys about drugs.
Mhm.
And one of the things that came out of that, what he was saying is that, listen, so you take drugs and you feel good about taking drugs. And the boys are sitting there, they're going, yeah, okay, some who tried drugs? A few put their hands up, others didn't, right? And then this was the main point. So you say you try the drugs as a 17 or 16-year-old because it gives you a nice feeling and it feels kind of cool. And then you tell yourself as a 16-year-old that you're going to try it again, right? So 9 months later, you're still trying it just for fun. And you're actually addicted and you don't realize that because you're a 16-year-old. So we had that discussion with the police officer. It was powerful how he explained it to them. And that really hit me. And I used that actually when I spoke to the girls' team. And I said, so you try vodka and you think you're having a nice time and it tastes good and you're doing something interesting. And nobody's blaming you or telling you that you shouldn't try anything in life. But you keep doing that, you're no longer in control. You believe you're just trying it and having fun, but now you're actually addicted to it. That's why you're doing it. And so that was our talk. So we do have to do that. We have to talk to the youth about those things and their experiences. But I don't think at the same time we don't go into it like with a big stick, judging them and telling them you don't do that because it's a very bad thing you've done. We have to understand that they're kids and they're going to experiment for fun. They're going to experiment or do things not for fun, but because it's a coping mechanism. They have 100 other reasons for doing it, right? And so it's not that they're trying to break the law. That's not the point. They're not going to do it because they want to do something bad. So we have to be careful not to be judgmental. And when we talked to them, we said, this is what can happen if you continue with this habit, right? We know you may have a reason for doing it, but we're suggesting to you that this is not the way to start. And then we offer help. With the police officer, for example, on that day, Coach Virgil and I, we're like brothers in the club, we actually said to the boys, it was the older age group, we said, listen, if you're doing it, right, it's not okay, but we're not going to kick you out of the club. We're not going to suspend you. You're not going to get in trouble. Just come talk to us so we can help you with it, right?
The role of the mentor. I have to tell you, you gave me cause for pause there because that example you gave with alcohol, and for the first time, you're seeing this being an emerging issue with girls. Our children are looking at us. How many of us as adults, I'll put my hand up, during the lockdown, and I think when we're talking about post-pandemic for us in Cayman, a lot of it is post-lockdown, and the continual effects of the pandemic around us. Put my hand up and say, when we're in lockdown, I found myself needing a coping mechanism more than ever. And as you said, maybe it's the girls seeing the parents, maybe reaching for that glass of wine more often than they normally would have before. And so it's a reminder to us that
to be mindful.
to be mindful of our behaviors as leaders, as adults, as parents.
Yeah. There's one thing I wanted to also just sort of tag on to this idea of coping mechanisms and addiction and access. Is one of the things that we saw was an increase in children accessing pornography because they were spending considerable amounts of time on the internet, often unsupervised under the umbrella of schoolwork. Parents were equally as engaged and engrossed in their own computers, doing their work, trying to keep their jobs and companies going. And when, kids can find pornography on the computer all the time, but when they have 18 hours in front of the computer, it just gives them more opportunity to find it, to look for it, and talk about a dopamine hit. When that clicks and you're a 12-year-old kid and you have a physiological response, which is biological and very natural and feels very nice, it becomes very difficult to then not go back there again and again and again. And so we had many calls from parents, very, very concerned. They'd found this in their browsers. They had walked in on their kid looking at this and would have never imagined. So it was another sort of thing that we hadn't really, if I could have thought about all the things that will go wrong during the lockdown, this hadn't hit my radar until it hit my radar.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm learning things this morning as well. Jason, I'm interested in your perspective.
Yeah, I just want to add on to what you said about being walking role models every day, all of us. Kids are observing, mostly, even when we're not aware they're observing. I remember being as a child, like I was listening in on my mom's conversations. I was, nosy. I was, and they pick up a lot more and they see and and we call them learned behaviors in psychology. So, that they learn how to communicate, they learn what to do, they learn, how to cope. So each of us has an opportunity to be a mentor, whether it's formal or informal. And there's one thing that always comes back to me in terms of one of the beliefs I have, and that is you can't ask anybody to do anything you're not willing and able to do yourself. And it really comes down to us walking the walk as adults and parents and professionals and teachers and coaches and cub leaders and scout leaders and all that stuff, for us to be able to walk that walk and not be a walking hypocrite, and role model those behaviors, because it's a lot easier for us to work on our stuff. We have that emotional development, we have that social development that they don't necessarily have yet. So, if we want to foster that resilience, then, we have to look at our own center of influence first, and see where we can be walking that walk.
Tara, when you go into the homes to do the critical work that you do, and again, I'm going to use the word hidden because a lot of the areas that you go into, most people in Cayman don't see. Are you seeing some of what is being discussed here this morning, some of these issues that are emerging, particularly with the young people?
Yes, definitely we are. And this week was just another reminder to us as a team how prevalent all of these issues are. And that's talking about being role models as mums and our kids watching us and young people watching us. That is why we have to start with the mum and the dad, not leaving the men out, but I can only speak from our experience, which is most heavily on single mums. That's why we have to start with her, because yes, mentors come in, it's on a Saturday, it's a couple of hours, it's at the club a few days a week, but they go home. Mom is around them all the time, most of the time. That's who we have to funnel all the positivity and build her up and educate her, and enable her to be the role model that her children need, and her all the cousins and all the kids living in the neighborhood that are coming over to her house. That's why, yes, mentoring the children is so invaluable and important, and it's a centerpiece of ARC in our work. But let's not forget the mum, because these mums, when we founded ARC, we're now taking care of their children. We've developed programs as we've learned, what's missing. And she didn't have what she needed then. That's why with the MARE program, we're taking the children when they're 7 years old. What we need to do is we need to equip them. These choices that come to them are thrown at them. Do you want to, try the vape? Do you want to try vodka? Do you want to try? This is happening to wealthy kids, disadvantaged kids. We need to set them up from young age to be ready for that moment. So we need to make sure that they have all the support networks, and that their mothers understand what is ahead for these children. How are we going to be ready for that? Be ready for those life choices where the ripple effect you can be trapped in it forever and ever. And that's what we see. A single mum who had made a poor choice, like we all do as teenagers. I most certainly did. She got pregnant. She wasn't able to graduate. She's living through the consequences of that for the rest of her life. Those are the young women we're trying to get their GED and get them back and get them working. So let's try and prepare the children for the moments when these choices come, they're face to face with them, to have the strength, to have had the mentors around them that they can see have experienced success. How do I experience success? How do I access that? What choices do I have to make to follow that path? The 12-year-old girl I assessed this week, sitting with her mom, they've been relying on the NAU for 7 years. They had chicken wings for dinner. They had one wing each, and that was it. The fridge was empty. And she said, I want to be free. I want to learn to read. I don't want to live like my mom. and trying to get the mum into a course too, so she can read. She's 34, she can't read. So let's get mum on track, right? Because that's where it's rippling down from. That's who they go home to.
Moms and dads are mentors too, right? So it's in our best
Absolutely. It
interest
starts
to
there.
build them up
Yeah.
at the same time as being mentors to
I think
the young
and
people.
and I think what Tara talks about in terms of supporting the family unit at home is so important, because we can do amazing things as community members to support young people at pivotal times in their life. And there's no doubt about that. I see that every day in my work as a psychologist, in the work of football, and just in mentorship of kids in my neighborhood. So I see the value in that. But if we want to actually make a bigger difference, so we don't have to keep having organizations like Big Brothers and Big Sisters looking for 100 new adults to step forward, I think is to Tara's point of figuring out where is all of this stemming. And I think our family systems are at risk. I think there's a great deal of vulnerable families, and I think there's a great deal of people who have never made a bad choice, but yet live in very difficult circumstances, because nobody makes a choice to be born into poverty. Nobody makes a choice to be born into disadvantage. And so people can find themselves in extremely different circumstances, of which they've not made a choice that has landed them there. Many of us are in the advantage positions that we are, not because of choices that we made, but because of circumstances into which we were born. And so we have to, I think, recognize the role of that and start to look. When we think neurologically, we know that there are sort of two key points of brain development across childhood, and that is early years, 0 to 5. So the quality of relationships, the quality of connection, the ability to keep stress away from those little ones is so important when we talk about things like learning. We talk about things like emotional regulation, decision making, all of that. The seeds of all of that are determined by the time a kid is 5. And so it's great to have them in a mentorship program if they're 7, but we have to do better. We have to sort of start preventing this, and we know what we need to do. We need really good home visit programs. We need support for mom. I myself do a lot of sort of parent-child therapy, which means we're not taking a kid and bringing them to me. The family's coming, right? And so my role is to be there for mom and support mom, so she can then in turn support child, right? There's nothing worse as a parent than seeing somebody give your child what you can't, right? What I can't do, that's heartbreaking as a parent. But to be able to be cared for or nurtured or taken, be important to somebody so that I can then in turn give that to my kid. I think those are the kinds of things that we need to recognize if we're going to look at this holistically and nationally in terms of what's really going to make a difference. The other really important part of brain development is in adolescence. And so if it didn't get there in early childhood, then we have this period of opportunity where this adolescent brain is very susceptible to stress, very susceptible to positive, responsive relationships, as well as a mechanism of healing and resiliency. And so we have lots of opportunity. But I agree with what Tara's saying in terms of we miss a great deal of opportunity in not doing a better job of supporting our very, very vulnerable families at those pivotal points when babies are very little.
There's also been, I think, a change. And anyone who's an expert, I'm not in sociology or psychology or both, will be able to explain this to us. And that is what from the work that I do with kids, there's definitely been a change in terms of the support that moms need. I say this because I'll confess to you that so when years ago when someone would say to me, oh, you got to have a dad around because you need a man to mentor you and make you I would say that argument, I don't know if I fully support that argument because I grew up with a mom without a dad, and I feel like I had everything I needed from a very strong woman. But as a generational thing, I think as time goes on, I think it's harder and harder and harder and harder for a single mom to do what she did 42 years ago, right? And I don't think we're in the same situation. And so with all those increased stresses, that's why I really love what I heard Tara talking about. That mom does need the support. I'll give you another bit of evidence. So hundreds of players we deal with, approximately 35 to 40% of them, I have never actually met the dad, right? And that's the real thing. So the mom is always there. She's present throughout, right? All the age groups right through. And about 25% of the kids, I know that isn't actually there. So the coaches and the mentors, we have to play that role, whether you're a male coach or a female coach. You're being that additional parent a lot of times. And it's kind of funny. I think about 3 months ago, I called Shannon one Sunday morning and I said, yo, so Shannon, so I just spoke to her mom, and she basically said she's done, and I have to take the son. And Shabby laughed, right? Because it happens all the time, but not that extreme. And the mom basically said, listen, I can't do this anymore, right? I am so done, right? You need to deal with this. And I'm the coach, I'm not the dad.
You're the mentor. You're the mentor. And when we
So
talk about
yeah,
the role that
so
mentors
so
play,
it was kind of interesting, a little bit funny, but it just shows how work that the stresses are exactly where you say they are, Tara. And I think if we can find more ways to support women, I certainly, maybe 10 years ago, I dropped my idea that it wasn't really about a dad. I dropped the idea because I realized that the situation now is very different from the one that my mom faced 40 years ago. It's very different now. The stresses are more, they're multiplied 100 times. The scenario, the whole circumstance, everything is just not that easy to be a single mom today versus, say, in the 70s or 60s.
John?
I was just going to add a couple of things that, without a doubt, and we say it in school quite a lot, that parents are the primary educators of their children. I say it at our graduation speech because we've normally got the most people watching. And some people are quite shocked by that. No, teachers are. No, parents are the primary educators of their children,
Right.
whether or not they're there, present, not present, whatever else. So this is about supporting parents to educate their children, and schools and other organizations and mentors and sports clubs all wrap around and help as a community. So that focus is absolutely spot on, in my opinion. And then secondly, we talk in school about having an unconditional positive regard for the young people that we serve, and I think that's absolutely key. That the danger of one of these kind of forums is that people start demonizing the young people in this, and that mustn't come out of a conversation like this, because we are laying ourselves bare and being very honest to the current situation, but this is a relatively small percentage of the population. Many parents are doing a phenomenal job. Many parents are struggling with all the conditions and everything that's going on, extreme poverty, and still doing a fantastic job. But there are some that need additional help and support, and we need to make sure we're not judgmental in that. I think that's really, really clear. So it's an unconditional positive regard for the students or for the young people, but also for the parents that are doing their best. We said it in lockdown a few times when parents were just freaking out. They were really freaking. And some of our teachers were freaking out because you only
We
had
were all
certain
freaking
days that
out.
you could go shopping, and they were trying to do stuff. So we talked about you only had to teach 50% of your lessons live, because if you were a teacher of a surname like me as a C, you had to go shopping on a Friday
Correct.
initially. So you couldn't be teaching all the way through that day, as some of the schools were doing. And we kept saying to the parents, to the students, and the teachers that your best is good enough. Just give us your best. But that best looks very different for me than it does to other people in the room and other people out in the community. And that's okay. Sometimes it's okay. We've got to make sure that whatever we do in these discussions, and however honest we are, that we don't demonize these young people or the parents that are struggling, because otherwise it'll have a negative impact from what we're trying to do.
But picking up from what you said in terms of the conversation that these forums lend themselves to, we do need to talk about it. We're not demonizing anyone. We recognize that everybody's circumstances are different, but we do need to talk about it so that everyone is made aware of it in case they're not aware of it yet, and recognize that this is being done with the most positive intent possible.
I think the strength for Cayman is our size, because we've got those differences in wealth, and it's such a diverse population as well. We've got the opportunities to make a difference. I think that's more than some places don't, but we're small, and that's our strength. It's also sometimes our weakness here. But I think everyone knows we could make huge differences. People here are making a huge difference every day.
And so when we talk about the role that mentors play, they come into a situation. How do we, from your experience, what advice would you give them when they're entering these situations so that they could make the most positive impact possible? Because it can be a bit awkward, right? A bit difficult. You don't want to make the parent feel bad. You don't want the parent to feel like you're superseding them. What is the gap that the mentor will fill, and how do they do so in the most positive way possible? Put that to any of you.
I'd like to
please.
jump in there. I was always taught that there's basic ABCs of helping. Achieve a relationship, boil down the problems, and challenge them to cope. And, nowhere in there Surprisingly enough, being a counselor, a lot of people think I give advice. But surprisingly enough, giving advice is probably the least helpful form of help there is. What people really need is to have a connection. And, before I do anything with anybody, I'll often ask, if someone's been in what they've been involved in before for counseling, sports, and, who do they talk to when they have problems and stuff, and who do they go to? What's worked, what hasn't worked? And most often, I'll find out that what has worked is they felt a connection with the person. And if it hasn't worked, they just didn't feel they got them. So that is so important. When I work with families, there is a fine line, because I don't want to come in and tell them what they're doing right or wrong. I don't really know, actually. So everybody's trying their best. I might have some suggestions or some things to try or whatever, but you got to build trust first. And I think that the things that the families that I do have success with, they know that I have their child at the best interest. They know that I have the parents at the best interest, that I want what they want, peace, harmony, growth, development in the home, and always trying to find a way to move closer and closer to that. So I think what a mentor provides is a combination of a consistent relationship, one that it's a lot easier. I'll give you an example. I can't counsel my wife. I'm too emotionally connected to her. So she needs to talk to someone. She's got to talk to someone else, because I'll for sure be defensive or feel attacked or, have and that happens in the home, right? I mean, we want to be safe, but that's kind of the biggest challenge we often have with our spouses, our children, our parents. That's the place that sometimes is the most difficult. So to take a step back, I think the mentors can provide that outside look. It can provide encouragement. It can provide that holding space, the unconditional positive regard, teach on communication styles and resolving conflict. Just kind of like and for me to be able to share my story, I make no qualms about self-disclosing, where I come from and what I've gone through, so that they know that I've been there, done that.
Yeah, I think that's where it really begins. It begins with honesty. I think people can tell right away if you're authentic. And oftentimes with mentors, they're there because perhaps they've had someone in their life that either chose to be a mentor or somebody in their life that really put them on track, an uncle, an aunt, a grandparent, a cousin or something. So when we go into homes, it's literally, we say, don't clean up. Though it's like a friend coming over, and we just sit down and listen, listen more and speak less. They want to be heard. It's the first time really that someone's actually sat and just heard them. And that's where it begins. And a lot of people get offered help. They're very defensive and then it never happens. So it's about being consistent. It's about showing up, be there, be honest, be sincere, share your own journey, things that you're experienced that you can help them with. Being honest is the place to begin, but also being consistent. Empty promises are the worst thing. To show up and say, oh, I'm going to fix your house, I'm going to teach your child, and we're going to this, that, and then not show up. That's where people really build walls, and it's about just being honest, consistent, and being there, being present.
Do you find that when you go into the homes or you're coaching or in school, that the young people who are facing challenges at home, they are more comfortable opening up to the mentor as opposed to their own parent? Do you find that that gives the mentor then the opportunity to go in and do some good work because they may actually feel a bit more comfortable talking to somebody who's not their parent? Is that an observation or not?
I think in my experience, it does occur, but you have to be very, very careful. There's a line. There's a line that's drawn, and you have to be careful not to step over it. And even all mentors step over that line sometimes, and they've stepped back when they realize they've gone too far. So the best example is you're listening, because that's what you're supposed to do, and you're listening and you're hearing a lot of stuff, and then you're tempted while listening to obviously help. Don't give advice, but that's your point, right? And so at some point, right, if you are really passionate, caring person, you will want to help, right? So you listen and then you want to help. And then the question is, how far do you go with your help? And so it might be that, mom or dad gives permission for the, the player to go to lunch with you, right? And what you might discover then is the player wants to go to lunch with you more and more and more and more and more and more and more. And that's when you start drawing the line because at some point, right, you have to allow them to cope with the challenge and you're trying to equip them to cope with the challenge rather than putting a band-aid on. You say, don't clean up, right? You can't fix the things, right? You can just help them to deal with the environment that they're in. And so I think you are going to get, you know, the demand for the support and you should offer support, but you have to be careful how far you go because you're trying to help them cope. One day you're not going to be there as a mentor, right? And how will they cope then? So I think it's very important to draw a line. What I would like to see in this country um, is some training really for mentors, and I mean everybody, including myself, coaches as well. The point is, it is important, right? You have 6 to 8 hours a week being spent by coaches um, with kids, and there's a missed opportunity to improve on the effectiveness of the mentorship that they give during that period, which is separate from the dealing with the sport itself.
Well, BBS has some wonderful training. So that's the first place to start. And it's not some extensive, overwhelming thing. I think people think, oh, training every weekend and it's going to be hours. But actually, if you call and speak to them, you'll
Yeah.
find that it's very straightforward and a lot of it's common sense. But it's something you have to go through, and there are scenarios, unless you've been around, at-risk families. There are a lot of things you just wouldn't believe were going on. So you do need to be prepared and have that experience, but definitely call them. They have it all sorted out.
The mindset, I think, is the most important prerequisite.
Okay.
You've got to really want to make a difference. This isn't ticking a form because you want permanent residency or, you want to do something for your church. This is something that you really, really want to make a difference to someone. So that consistency is there. Because sometimes that puts the whole program down. What you said about, the attachment and false promises or giving some false hope, that just sends these students or these young people backwards. And it can happen. They're incredibly vulnerable normally. So if you're going to step forwards and put yourself forward there as a mentor, and I'm not trying to put anybody off, but your mindset is the most important thing. You've got to do it for the right reasons, and then you get the training because it's not easy. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it. We wouldn't have any issues or problems. And then you've got to be prepared to be resilient and model that resilience to the young child that you're trying to show resilience to. I've had some mentors that have been attached to the school, and I've sort of seen them on the way into the school. You okay? You're here for the mentoring. They're full of enthusiasm and say, "Oh, I didn't turn up today." Did you try and find them? No, I've given them half an hour. It's my lunch break. I've got to go now. And you're like, there may be a reason why this child is not there. There's a reason they needed a mentor. Just those barriers, rather than bounce onto something else. So it sounds a bit harsh, but I absolutely think if you haven't got the right mental approach to start off with, then you're not going to do it for the right reasons.
No, thank you for that. I think that was very important and needed to be said. And before I open it up to the audience here for any questions that they may have, one question I do want to ask, and you actually helped me segue to it, is the idea of resiliency. How would you explain the idea of mentoring and the role that mentors play in lending itself to building a resilient community? Shannon, I put that to you.
I think resiliency is the capacity to cope in adversity. That's the definition. And so, we talk about resiliency in children as something we can give to children. And I always say we can't sprinkle resiliency on top of children. You out of it more resilient. There are those plants that can grow in the crack of a sidewalk, and there are those that require perfect amount of light and sun, and they're very, very delicate. And we want resilient children because they're going to face hard things. Even the most insulated, relatively non-adverse lives, there's going to be challenges. There'll be death, there'll be frustration, there'll be failure, we want children to be resilient, but in order to build resilient children, we have to allow them to go through some difficulty, and we have to make sure that they have critical relationships around them to buffer that, to reduce the stress. That's what resiliency is. It's our brain needs to be able to sometimes have a break from the stress that it's carrying. And I use the example actually of a water glass. Sometimes we can all hold a water glass for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes, but if we had to hold it for 18 months, which is where we are right now with COVID, that's a long time. And it doesn't matter that it's just a small glass of water, it's how long you're carrying it. And so if a child lives in poverty or they live with disadvantage, it doesn't matter how bad it is, it matters how long they are in that situation. And so we need to be able to have people around them at those key times to give them that resilience so they can continue, because it might be that they will remain in those circumstances for a while. And so we can't think of mentorship as fixing problems, but of giving those kids the opportunity to develop the emotional regulation, the ability to cope, the ability to problem solve in the face of adversity. Not necessarily plug them out of it and give them a taste of a beautiful life and pop them back in. That's not building resiliency. That's making things worse. I think building resiliency is having a relationship, and that's what Big Brothers and Big Sisters does so well, is that they say, let's build a relationship with this person, with this young person, so that they start to believe in themselves. They start to see that there's choices. They start to, when they're angry, they can stay calm. When they're, frustrated, they can hang in there a little bit longer. So they're, emotional regulation, the ability to stay connected, those are the signs of resilient people. And those are the things that we have to, as adults, help children to learn. Babies don't calm themselves. They rely on us to calm them. And as children grow, they develop those self-regulatory skills. That's why your 2-year-old can't wait for dinner or for the bottle to be warmed up, but your 5-year-old can wait. They might whine and they're a bit fussy, but they can wait. And then by the time you're an adult, you can be starving, but you can sit through a panel without breakfast, right?
Someone send a glass.
I heard my tummy.
Because we've learned to self-regulate into adulthood. We couldn't ask a baby to do that. We couldn't ask a toddler or 5-year-old to do that. And so we're regulating with those kids. When we show up consistently, when we're warm and reliable, we're teaching them how to do that so they can do it for themselves when they're faced with difficulties.
And so the cultivation of resilient individuals, and that's where the mentors come in, will then in turn create resilient communities.
Definitely.
Right. So with that, is there any question that an audience member would like to ask? Patrick over here. John?
I mean,
Like-
sorry.
I'll just comment first. I think some of the permanent things are actually more on the positive side, I believe. I think about some of the skills that we have all been forced to learn in terms of being okay in uncertainty, dealing with our anxiety. There was a time at about 10 to 2 every day when they were having their daily press releases, my anxiety would start up. It was like, it was like I was getting conditioned like the dog with the treats, you know. And I actually started to develop a fear of going outside around, because I'd go out for my walk at 5 o'clock on Walker's Road, and there's people and like all this. So, but started to learn that I had to walk through those anxieties. I mean, practice what we preach. Started to learn that there's also some good things that can come out of this uncertainty and some critical thinking skills. I actually think that the youth are probably more resilient than we give them credit for at times. I always say human beings are amazing when we have to do something. Sometimes we say we can't do it, but when we have to, we do. And I think that some really positive things are going to come out of this in terms of our young people learning to be adaptable, learning to thrive in uncertainty more than anything else.
John?
I think the whole online learning has prepared our young people for a world where actually a vast percentage of people get their degrees online now. So they're very, very skilled. They've taken a big jump well ahead of people that were going on to do graduate courses. So that's a really, really strong thing. And they're incredibly skilled in that area. I think as well, they're in the position now where they realize that we actually need each other. We've got some fantastic cooks and people that can do agricultural work and grow things, and that you're seeing that reconnection really with some of the basics in life that we'd kind of forgotten about, or we drifted off a little bit more from in the community. So that's really good. That's a strong thing. And also for us within school, I think people are recognizing that actually when we do have people together, we need to value those connections, and actually look at how powerful it is when we collaborate and work in person together, like in this forum. We don't need to sit students in a classroom and they're all working individually all of the time. Once we've got them there, that's precious time. We can do all that work outside of school on a computer or whatever. But when we're together, let's work together. Let's get that power of collaboration.
I think there are lots of positives, but I have to say I think there are maybe a couple of negatives as well. So I think, for example, if you think about situations where kids needed help and they always needed help. Imagine those situations. It might be a small number, but it's very important. I think it's very important. And they might be going to counseling or going to a wellness center or somewhere to get some help. Imagine that there was a period of 5 to 7 months where the support that you normally got, you didn't get. That's number one, right?
Mhm.
And then coming out of that, so it may not be a permanent impact, but it's long term to recover from that, right? So that's one thing I think that's really critical. Two, imagine that during that period, because of the stresses, you went somewhere you shouldn't have gone, right? You went one path that you shouldn't have gone down, right? We talked about coping mechanisms and so on, things that you did. I can tell you that you don't just snap out of that, right? It could take years in some situations. I know of some, so I'm just revealing the truth to you. So there are situations that you get into caused by the pandemic that will take quite a while to come out of properly. You don't just recover because the pandemic is gone and you took your mask off. You're not fine. So I think there are some negative impacts that will last a bit longer, potentially a few years, because of things that occurred during the period. So there has been some damage, hopefully not too much, but there are definitely cases of that.
I think the mental health needs, we have a very small mental health unit at the HSA. And in my 25 years as a mental health professional, have probably personally walked, I don't know, half a dozen people to that ward. And in the last year and a half, have personally walked dozens of people to that ward. And so we've
Eight-bed
seen,
unit at
yeah, we've
HSA.
seen it. I think Dr. Lockhart said recently, he was saying, it normally hovers at a, half full sort of thing. And it has been at capacity since the pandemic started. And so we're seeing that on that end of the more severe mental health cases, we're seeing a significant increase. We're seeing people that maybe had a predisposition, where a mental health problem has emerged, are now going to have to learn how to live with that, and going to be able to have the support that they need. So we saw two things. We saw those who already had mental health problems have those exacerbated to a degree that they required a much more intense level of care. And then we saw those who maybe always had good skills to cope with it, or good support, but yet in the absence of that now, those situations have emerged or have developed into maybe a more of a severe mental illness now. And I think, like Paul said, those are the things that we don't just those don't just
It'll
turn
take
off.
a while to
To resolve or to now
resolved
be
or
treated.
rectified, yeah.
Shannon, there's no provision really for young people at the hospital, though, is there, for
So we
mental
don't
health?
know.
Still?
We don't have a mental health unit, although I know that the HSA is working really hard right now with the Alex Panton Foundation, I think, to get that set up, an adolescent hub. But the beds at the mental health unit at HSA are adult beds only. So if there is an adolescent who is, say, unable to keep themselves safe, or who is having a psychotic episode, they typically need to be in the adult ward, which is not ideal. And not safe, or they need to be on the pediatric ward, which then creates other risks for other children that are in the pediatric ward. So it is a difficult situation. Yeah.
One minute. Yeah, okay. Sorry, and then Ms. Angela.
There's an old saying that says it takes a village, right? And certainly a lot of us grew up in an era where we were raised by uncles, aunts, and even friends of our parents. Um, what factors do you believe have influenced a dramatic shift away from that concept?
I think there's a story my husband tells all the time, that that he uses as an example between some of the challenges that kids have now and some of the challenges that kids had way back when. And he grew up in central Georgetown, very poor, what we would now sort of consider a situation of great disadvantage or adversity. Lots of love, but no money. And so he says, you know, when he was a kid, he always knew that there were those people that had more than him. He always knew that there were those kids that had bigger houses or had went places on planes during summer holidays when he didn't. But you never really knew what that was like because you just then got distracted by your own summer holidays or your own life. Whereas he said nowadays, the kids can see into the lives of all of those other people through Instagram and
Social media.
Snapchat and Facebook. And so it's no longer that you imagine what their life might be like. It's now that you see it every day in your face. And during the pandemic, you sat at home on your phone 24 hours a day looking at how they had what you didn't have. And that, I think, is the glass of water. You carry that stress every day over a prolonged period of time, that becomes more and more difficult to cope with. So it's not that there hasn't always been poor people and rich people. The difference is, it's that I think the kids now
The
are,
veil is off. We have the window.
they see it, they see it. And I think back to your point as well, that community has, he will speak about sort of not having that necessarily that community of knowing everybody in your neighborhood and knowing all the people that you're going to pass on your way home to school that are going to check in on you or report back to your parent if something's awry, right?
Tara, I'm
Well,
interested because I think you'd have an interesting perspective.
Well, I would say that the broken families, I suppose it's an interesting question because it really does all boil down to mental health and not having a support network. Because the broken families we see, there's very toxic relationships. Human nature is very judgmental, and families are at war all over the island, all over the world. But I can only speak of what I see here. And pretty much every family that we pull into our mentorship program, education program, or we're helping to rebuild their home, whatever modality we're trying to use to improve their lives, we see that they are really alone. And we say, well, where is your family? And we get to talk about that at length. And when we complete a CASA project, for example, they say, we've had this said many times, you know, strangers have come and changed my life and rebuilt my house. You know, my family are watching and they haven't shown up. That's something we really have to look at and address, you know, and that's mental health. You know, that's the stresses of life. They've fallen into addiction. You know, unless you keep pulling families together, and mentors can be a big, vital part of doing that, helping family members rebuild relationships. It's not just about you being a mentor with that person. It's about bringing people together and breaking down boundaries, because we can start to just sort of pull into a shell and separate ourselves from one another because of the conversations going on in our heads. But we need to meet in the human level, the human factor. And those families do love each other, and we've managed to see some really big breakthroughs in relationships, so that when we do step away, if we have to step away, they're not left alone again, right? That they're working on and teaching the young how you deal with conflict resolution, you know, how you walk with God's heart and God's love and without judgment. And that is something that we really need to go back to the drawing board, I think, with our youth in schools across Ireland, talking about that and not being so quick. It is our human instinct to be quick to judge. And it isn't unless you have, you know, just from my perspective, everybody has a different way of viewing things. But if you have God's heart and you lean on him and you learn what love looks like, how does he describe it? Look it up. What does it mean? All of those things, that's how we should be approaching one another. And it just sometimes takes a little, you know what, I'm really sorry, you know, let's talk this through. But you do need mediators, and you do need encouragement, and you do need to be reminded about your relationship and how you need each other, and why it's important to be forgiving and not hold people in that place where they've made mistakes or they've hurt one another. We need to focus on rebuilding relationships. It all starts with relationship, as simple as that.
Yeah, I think actually it's a very good question. I think I've always thought that. So that question I asked myself for years, and my own answer is that it relates to two things. I think the question is basically, where's the village? I think that's your question, right? You're saying, where's the village today? Don't quite see the village that we used to see. What's happened to it? And I think there's two things. One is the point that I think Tara mentioned regarding moms, but actually applies to all parents generally as well, right? So one is, I think over time, there's been more and more and more sort of economic stress. If you do read any of the research out there, you'll see the pace of development in all the countries has resulted in sort of a deterioration in social situations, right? And so what you find is that individually parents, uh, they tell themselves and they tell you, they tell us that they have less time, right? Less time. You said, why you mean you have less time? Well, I have less time because I have to cope. I have to work. It's very busy. I have lots to do. And so you find that they don't seem to have enough time. Take it down to be more specific. So let's go to families that are the low income families, right? Even less time, right? Less time as in they don't have the luxury of thinking about certain things that other people think about. Okay, they're just trying to make sure there's something to eat today. There's a breakfast, there's lunch, maybe there's only lunch, right? They're just making sure that your basic health is okay. Maybe there's no insurance, right? So they have to find a way to deal with that. So because they're dealing with survival at a very basic level, it's a luxury to talk about the correct way to raise a kid, the correct way to talk to a kid, how to motivate properly. Don't say negative things. Don't say those kinds of words. It's very bad. All the studies show that those types of things are very bad for kids. Don't say negative things. If you're a coach, don't shout. Don't tell the player, oh, you need to be more confident. Don't do things like that because they're damaging. The issue is that at that level, those individuals, they're concerned about so many other more fundamental things that those types of lectures and those types of discussions about how to do things differently don't factor in. It's not that they don't care, it's that their capacity to be able to get that information and understand it and apply it is just like, well, I'll deal with that some other time, right? Right now, I need to make sure I save his life. So I'm shouting at him to say, don't cross the road because the car is coming. I'm not going to tell you why, right? I'm not going to explain why you shouldn't cross the road. I'm going to say, because I want to save your life this second, do not cross that road. Otherwise, you're going to hear from me, right? And so that is a survival technique. So that's the first thing. I think we're busy. Economic livelihoods is just worse. The second thing I think is education, right? And so I believe that we are learning, we're all learning as we get older about all the things that maybe we shouldn't have done years ago, right? Right? So we're learning about that, and I think we need to continue to get that information out there. And the reason I mentioned training earlier, and big brothers, big sisters do it, but I'm going to make my point more specifically, right? Is that there are many, many thousands of hours spent by adults with kids every week. This is my point specifically. If you say to a coach or some other sport, we're going to teach you to be a mentor. They say, oh, I don't want to be a mentor. What's that? I don't want a certificate in mentorship. I don't want to get into mentor stuff. The truth is they're mentoring every day, all the time, right? They just don't think of it as mentorship. So my idea about education and training is to actually get a hold of those people that are spending thousands of hours a week with kids and who may not be using it as effectively as we all in this room would like them to be. And actually show them how those mentorship skills relate to the things they're doing every day because they are mentors. They just don't see it that way. And I think that that type of education would help as well. The education around what parents should do and the right things that we should all do, we're hearing it all the time. But I think forums like this would help as well in terms of getting that, showing them what it really means, right? But don't be judgmental. Just kind of say, hey, this can work a little differently in this way. But if you're going in with a kind of a, they're very judgmental, they're not going to want to hear that either. So it's capacity to listen and to develop those skills. And the capacity isn't there if you're focused on fundamentals, number one. And two, it's education as in what can we do to make them more aware in a nice way and help train people to become better mentors.
I was just going to say on the time thing as well. I mean, it is capacity. You get messages on these things about your analytics, you know, your screen time went down. Imagine you had that for the amount of time you spent, quality time you spent with your kids as a parent. You know, we pay quite a bit of attention to that and the number of emails you processed a week or the number of active connections or new connections you made. But if you just got back, and we had that conversation a few times when we were at that stage very early, when people said, the child can't get online. I said, but you've got a cell phone. I just need you to come off of Facebook for an hour a day for the child to be able to do this, or EK or whatever it is. But priorities, you know, and that's hard, and doing it in a non-judgmental way. But actually, as parents, if we all just stop, and it doesn't have to be a huge amount of time. These kids are very used. The children are very, very used to a fast-paced life. They don't need to sit down to you for 2 hours to read a story before bedtime anymore. But you know what? 5 or 10 minutes of quality time with them just before bed for a younger child is invaluable. And we've seen that with the students that are coming to school that can't read. You know, when we had discussions with Life very early on, and we were talking about making sure every child left school being able to read, and we need to make sure every child gets to school being able to read at the very, very start in that early years education program. But they'll only do it if parents and the village rep round and spend 5, 10 quality minutes a day with them. And you look at that as a parent, I mean, we've all got busy lives. You can find time. You need to find ways of finding time and prioritizing over social media or shopping or connecting with somebody that you're not going to have so much impact with.
And, you know, just to highlight what everyone has been saying, none of what's been said is being done so in a judgmental manner.
No.
The idea is that we are highlighting the issues, bringing it to the attention, so then the remedies can start
Yeah.
into motion. And speaking of time, I know we're probably well over, but I know that Ms. Angela has a question she would like to ask.
It actually isn't a question. I think it's a comment, Paul, that's come from panelists. You're not very honest in Cayman. We have a divided education system where we go to one school and they go to another. We do not own poverty in Cayman, so it's all behind. It's not on the main road. It's
Mhm,
back there. And
Hidden.
and families are disconnected because I have a Q5 and you don't, and so I'm on another side of the road. And until this forum is fabulous, absolutely, and clearly I'm fully excited about it. But I'm just desperate to say to Cayman that we will never rise. Indigenous people will not rise if we do not take seriously the kinds of issues this panel is giving space to. Because the fundamental piece is poverty in Cayman, and this is no judgment, Mr. Clark, is horrific. It is absolutely horrific. Poverty, food insecurity in Cayman is serious today, not during lockdown. I'm talking about today. Because we have littles where the parents can guarantee a lunch or a meal. Now, I think the important piece, the point I'm trying to make here is, Cayman, let's listen to what this panel has to say, and let's take seriously, this isn't about what government will do or what private sector will do. This is where is the community and how will we come together? Because the truth is, the folks who are millionaires in this country, as many of us Caymanians say, they have somewhere to go. The Caymanian folks who are in poverty of one sort or another have nowhere to go. I really needed to say that.
Thank you,
And
Angela.
I'll tell you another story on that. When we, at John Gray, when we do bag searches every now and again, you'll have a wave where we're trying to make sure and just send a message out that drugs don't get into the school. The thing we found most post-COVID is 49 cents cup noodle cups for lunch, which says a lot about where we are with nutrition. So, I mean, there's a lot of really positive steps that the government have said about free school meals and greater integration, etc. But that's just another example, and that was really alarming to me. Just how many parents are giving their child just a cup noodle or whatever you want to call it.
I think there's just one sort of thing that falls on what Miss Angela's been saying, and it's why I always answer Paul's phone calls no matter what time of day they come, is that I think sometimes we think in this community, and I've only been part of this community for 30 years, so I can't claim to be from here, although I like to think that I'm from here. but we see this sort of mentorship often as something that gets done by those people who have to those people who don't have. And we see it along racial lines, and we see it along immigration status. And I think the conversations that Miss Angela is speaking to, we have lots of those conversations. And I think one of the challenge during COVID in particular was that while we were dealing with COVID here, we were also dealing with a global social justice experience. And so many of our young people were sitting at home on lockdown, and they were also watching the murder of George Floyd, and they were learning about racism in a different way, and they were thinking about it, and they were talking about it in a way that we don't talk about that here. Um, and and we pretend that doesn't exist here. And so we will talk about economic disadvantage, and we'll talk about um, different socioeconomic status, but we don't talk about the racial disparities, and we don't talk about racism. And I think those things were highlighted during the pandemic, and people felt them because they were watching it in another country, and then they were watching it spread around the world, but they were going, where it's not spreading here? Why aren't we? Where's our protest? Where's our, where's the anger here? And I think young people are often the ones that bring about this change in the world, which is wonderful. And so I think they've been additionally stressed by that. Like they've had all these feelings and all these experiences, but yet not even maybe having a forum to talk about it, not having people who want to hear that. And then often they're, especially if you're a poor Black Caymanian family, you're often looking at people that are not of your color who come in to help. And so then that creates real difficulties. And those are honest things. And I think, those are the things we have to talk about, which is why I think organizations where there are young or old Caymanian men
She looked at you there.
who are at the helm. Those are the programs that need to be supported, right? Where there's representation, young kids who are vulnerable, who need mentorship. They also need some representation in that mentorship. They need to see in themselves the person who stands in front of them to help, so that they see that that is possible within me. And if the people that they're looking at to help are always different than them, that I think can be problematic. And so if this is a forum to sort of get people interested in mentorship, then I would appeal to any young Caymanian man or woman who wants to get involved. Men, I'm getting the cue to say men, because I think that's going to start to make really significant changes, and we can be mentored by the people who look and sound like us, right? That's profound.
So I think what's really clear, Pilar, is that we do need to have another forum, right? So we are really out of time now. I do know that Johan has been waiting to ask.
Woody has a question.
Oh,
Woody.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we certainly have seen an increase in people willing to access mental health, because it's now a very acceptable thing, because now it's kind of part of the COVID experience. Lots of organizations had mental health professionals in to talk about how do you take care of your mental health. So it has become an acceptable conversation. And I think the mental health community is trying to really maximize that so that it isn't something that fades away. It isn't something that was important during COVID but doesn't remain important. And I also think those kind of celebrity decisions, that this idea of I can step away from something great because my mental health is even greater, is really important. Yeah.
okay. I want to thank you very much for your insights this morning, for the questions, and it gives me great pleasure now to welcome to the stage a little brother here with us today. Can you please give a round of applause to Justin Wright, who's going to give us his vote of thanks. And I do want to point out he's 15 years old.
Wow.
Okay, so I'd like to start off by saying first, good morning to everyone. Hope you're having an amazing morning. And yeah, my name's Justin Wright, and I may not look very little, but yes, I'm a little. And so I'm here to give the vote of thanks, but it's a lot more than that because I'd like to start off by, well, telling you guys a little story. So there was this kid. He didn't like school very much. I believe this kid had an attendance rating of 60% in year seven. Stayed in all day playing video games, didn't like to make friends. It was very, very, very overweight to the point where I had a risk of diabetes actually. But then I went to see a counselor. And yes, that little kid's me, just spoiler alert. And this little counselor referred me to Big Brothers Big Sisters. And well, I mean, it's been a wild ride since then. Since 6 years ago, when I got matched with my big, whose name is Nick, by the way. Yeah, there's been a lot of change, basically. Um, Through his help and through help of many other people, well, personally, I've gotten more interest in school. I've actually got accepted to Cayman Prep recently, which is I. And I mean, education really wasn't just the only issue I was facing. Like, there was issues at home. I mean, I'm not saying that I wouldn't describe myself as being someone that's living in like extreme poverty, but like I was never the person that could ever shop in any fancy places or really go out and do all these things that other people could. And through the help of Big Brothers Big Sisters, all their sponsors, and actually, oddly enough, some of the panelists, John Clark, he's my principal, and
Very proud.
and you just like the things that he's done for the kids at my school. Like I tell some of my friends that maybe go to school in other countries, for example, and I tell them what the kind of things that our school does here, and they're like, I mean, sir, are you sure you're okay? Sorry. Are you sure you're actually going to school? Because like literally none of the people at my school do this kind of thing, and it's crazy to see like the amount of support that like some of our students get. And also, for example, Miss Tara, she's actually been helping rebuild my house since you see the example that she was giving, maybe roofs caving in and things like that. Yeah, that might have been my house a few months ago. And I also want to say thank you so much for the help you've been giving us, and even in terms of mental health, like with Miss Shannon and Jason. Like I may not have I may not have received mental health support from their specific organizations, but just the access to counseling and psychology that I've had recently just really helped me, especially like and actually academically as well. Like that's part of the reason why I started showing up to school more, because over there I was able to get the support that I needed. And even with like sports as well, like Paul, he's a coach, and I'm actually part of the Cayman Islands national boxing team. And just yeah, going to training, well, it's tough, especially in the mornings. Like I'm assuming y'all know that right now. It's probably some of us, including me, is fighting through some hunger. But yeah, I just sometimes there's just nothing I look more forward to in the week than just going to boxing, talking to some of my friends, and just just sharing a all around just great experience. And I just want to thank everyone who's been collaborating with Big Brothers Big Sisters, because I feel like the message that I want to leave with you all today is actually, I might be paraphrasing a bit from a radio interview I once did, is that to make a difference in life, you can't just sit around and expect that difference to happen. You have to go out yourself and put that difference into the world. And especially with youngsters, since I actually really like the point that Tara brought up earlier, was that a lot of mentors are people that have been mentored before. So
This one.
all of our sponsors, for example, you're not just sponsoring a company who's helping young children. You're helping young children who are then going to help more young children. So what you're doing is you're sort of planting a seed that's going to eventually grow into this whole network of people that really like what they enjoy the most in life is to help other people. And yeah, well, if you guys haven't heard this already, thank you so very much. And especially coming from me, like it's absolutely changed my life being part of Big Brothers Big Sisters, and I couldn't appreciate it enough.
I can think of no better way of ending this very, as I've been calling it all morning long, important forum. Thank you very much, Justin, for those candid words, your experience that you shared. Again, thank you to everyone here, the panelists, to everyone in the audience, to Big Brothers, Big Sisters, for those who made this possible, our three Maples Group and Tower. And yes, you see, you got me. You got it. And to all of you at home for tuning in. Again, thank you. And For those who are here, please enjoy some light refreshments. And yes, we're going to do this again, right? Hello? Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great
Thank
day.
you.